Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will continue our series of working through the resurrection accounts of the four canonical New Testament Gospels. Last week, we treated Matthew's account. This week, we will concentrate on Mark's Gospel, chapter 16. This Gospel requires considerable comment, primarily because of its ending. Most scholars agree that the Gospel originally concluded in verse 8 of chapter 16. However, there are manuscript traditions in which Mark 16, 9 through 20 seems to be appended to this brief chapter. Early on in the history of the Christian Church, it appears that many accepted the longer ending as a genuine section of this gospel. For our purposes, we will treat the whole chapter as canonical and therefore recognized by most Christians as essential to the gospel message. This story begins when, after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices to anoint Jesus' corpse. That's in verse 1. Very early on the first day of the week, which would have been Sunday, they went at sunrise to the tomb. That's in verse 2. As they made their way to the tomb, they discussed what they were going to do with the stone that blocked entry into the tomb. They figured that this stone could not be easily moved, so they wondered whether someone who could help them might be around. That's in verse 3. But when they arrived, they realized that the stone, which happened to be very large, had already been rolled away from the entrance. That's in verse 4. The evangelist mentioning the stone's size suggests that the women would have had found it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to move the stone on their own. Now that the stone no longer blocked the tomb's entrance, that problem was solved for these women. So, when they arrived, they were able to enter the tomb. At that point, the women saw a young man dressed in a white robe. Obviously, they were amazed by this sight. That's in verse 5. Immediately, the young man had something to say. He told them not to be astonished. He also knew that they were looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who had just been crucified. In fact, the young man continued, "He is not here, because he has risen." Then he showed the women the place where Jesus' body had been placed during burial. That's in verse 6. After saying this, and after pointing out where Jesus' body had been set down, he told the women to tell his disciples, that is Jesus' disciples, and Peter, that Jesus was going to be in Galilee. That is where, just as Jesus had said previously, where the women and the people who they tell will see him. Of course, this fits with what Jesus had said in chapter 14, verse 28 of the Gospel of Mark, that, quote, "After I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee," end of quote. But the women trembled and were astonished upon hearing this. They simply ran from the tomb. Most interesting is that they were too afraid to say anything to anyone. Apparently, they kept this incredible news to themselves. That's in verse 8. Upon reading verse 9, however, one has to deal with a whiplash effect. In that section, we are told that when he, clearly referring to Jesus, rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom previously he had exorcised 7 demons. In this iteration, she went and told people who had been with him, that is, with Jesus. This prompted everyone she told to mourn and weep. As a matter of fact, though, when she told them that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, no one believed her. That's in verse 11. It gets worse. He, again referring to Jesus, appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country. That's in verse 12. This seems to refer to other disciples or followers. However, what in another form means is not explained. Is this suggestive of the episode in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus interrupts the two people on their way to Emmaus near Jerusalem? In that scene, neither of these people recognized Jesus. Was that because he was, quote-unquote, in another form of some sort? The text in Mark provides no clues as to what this might mean. Nevertheless, this appearance seemed to do little good. When the two to whom Jesus had appeared went back and told the other disciples and the other followers, pointedly, quote, they did not believe them. That is, the two people to whom Jesus had appeared. That's in verse 13 of chapter 16. After that, Jesus finally showed up to the 11 themselves as they sat down to eat. Jesus was upset. He criticized them for their unbelief and hardness of heart. This, of course, was primarily because they had failed to believe the witnesses who had seen him after he had risen from the dead. That's in verse 14. After this criticism, he enjoined them to go worldwide to preach the gospel to all the created order. Quite bluntly, Jesus insisted that anyone who believes and gets baptized will be saved, but condemnation will be the reward for those who do not believe. Presumably, the gospel in this statement has to do with what Jesus taught and the implications of the cross and subsequent resurrection. That's in verse 16. There is little context to know precisely what being saved or condemned means. Of course, throughout Christianity, statements like this were construed to signify that being saved meant finally going to heaven, whereas being condemned meant going to hell. But neither term is ever mentioned in this context. Jesus continues. He mentions the signs that will accompany those who believe in him. These signs include the ability to exorcise demons, speak in tongues, pick up serpents without being harmed, and drink any deadly thing, that is, poison, and suffer no harm. Also, those who believe will be able to lay hands on the ill so that they will recover. That's in verse 18. At this juncture, Jesus ascended into heaven and assumed a position at the right hand of God. That's in verse 19. As well, they, presumably the people to whom Jesus had most recently spoken, went out to preach as Jesus had commanded. The Lord worked with them in this task, and the signs that Jesus had mentioned confirmed the message that they were proclaiming. Most Bibles use the longer ending that included verses 9 through 20, despite the contradiction that is apparent. One authority includes after verse 8 these words, "But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him and all that they had been told. And after this Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and the imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." Very few people regard this statement as canonical. Perhaps the most problematic matter involving the longer ending is some of the signs. A relatively small minority of Christians have regarded speaking in tongues as a sign of spiritual authenticity, or something that is requisite for Christians in general. Also, the belief that one can pick up a snake, presumably a poisonous one, and be unfazed by a bite has been taken literally by an extremely small group of Christians. The same goes for the idea that Jesus will protect anyone who drinks any deadly thing. Again, most Christians would reject the idea of taking this literally. Even the promise that healing will come more or less automatically by laying on hands, and that this will demonstrate that the gospel has been properly preached, hardly has widespread support. Nonetheless, Mark's version of Jesus' resurrection, for the most part, accents disbelief. In the shorter version, the one ending in verse 8, the women were afraid to heed the young man's admonition to tell Jesus' disciples and Peter that he had risen. They spoke to no one. In the longer version, Mary Magdalene did report Jesus' appearance, but no one believed. The same thing happened after Jesus made another appearance to two of his followers or disciples. No one believed their report. Finally, when he appeared to the inner circle, the 11, Jesus scolded them for their unbelief and hardness of heart. Even after this, we are never told in this gospel the 11 believed. The only indication of a change of heart was in 16, verse 20, when we learn that they went forth and preached everywhere, and that the signs confirmed their message. Presumably, that refers to the disciples. In next week's podcast, we will treat Luke's version of the resurrection. For now, let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, record there your email for me, and if you would like me to answer a question in a subsequent Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.